Welcome. Good afternoon if you are here in this hemisphere, and good morning if you're in another hemisphere. You're very much, and good evening if you're in the other part of the world. You're very much welcome to this webinar, the first webinar on special untold stories about occupied Palestine. My name is Jeff Handmaker, and I work at the International Institute of Social Studies, the ISS in The Hague, which is hosting this series of webinars. We're based at Erasmus University in the Netherlands, and I'm also going to be your moderator of this webinar. This is the first in a four-part series hosted by the ISS together with colleagues from the Legal Mobilization Platform in conversation with academic and societal partners and with the active participation of Francesca Albanese, who is well known to most, if not all of you, as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in this Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. She is also an Italian lawyer and has written numerous reports on this topic. So the events of the 7th of October 2023 are in urgent need of an international and independent investigation. What is clear is that around 1,200 Israelis have been killed, although the circumstances of their deaths are not clear. And at least 35,000 Palestinians have been killed, including an estimated 15,000 children, according to UNICEF, through Israel's relentless bombing campaign, which has been followed by a ground assault. Israel's military operation has led to the forced displacement of nearly the entire population of Palestinians in Gaza, mass starvation, and deliberate prevention of vital humanitarian aid. While Israel's recent military campaign is but the latest in countless military offensives, the use of military force in the past 6 months has been of unprecedented proportion. As we know, it followed attacks against Israel by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups who have been revolting against 75 years of settler colonial dispossession, 56 years of military occupation of Palestinian territory, and 16 years of an air, sea, and land blockade of the Gaza Strip. Israel's attacks have flattened entire neighborhoods, including hospitals, churches, mosques, schools, and shelters. 2.2 million Palestinians are at risk, severe risk of starvation. All of these atrocities have been accompanied by genocidal statements by Israeli governmental and military high-ranking officials, which we'll discuss in the second webinar of this series. States have not only shown an unwillingness to prevent human suffering and to hold Israel accountable, they've even suspended funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, accompanied by political narratives that lack legal authority. There have, nevertheless, been several accountability efforts activated, mainly by civil society organizations, to hold the perpetrators of these crimes accountable, including at 2 apex courts in The Hague, which we will also discuss in parts 3 and 4 of this webinar series. These webinars aim to elevate current discussions around the application of international law to the long-standing impasse between Israel and the Palestinians, making clear that the violence that erupted since October 2023 both has an important context, as well as profound implications for the international legal order. To attendees, you may pose a question in the chat at any time, and our colleague is going to be monitoring those questions, which will come forward in the third part of this webinar. But to better understand these issues, we will interact with experts on themes that are relevant to understanding the current situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as its root causes, which brings me to today's webinar, entitled October 7, 2023, Terrorism or National Liberation Movement. We're questioning this. We will discuss the Hamas movement, its history and development in order to make sense of what the events of 7th of October 2023 were all about. In addition to Francesca Albanese, who I've already introduced, we are privileged to welcome Tareq Baconi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correct, sir, and Shad Hamoure. A few words of introduction. Dr. Tareq Baconi holds a doctorate in international relations from King's College in London, as well as degrees from the Universities of Cambridge, Imperial College London, and Sydney. In addition to being a member of the Institute of Palestine Studies, he is president of the board of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, a global network of Palestinian analysts and researchers. And he wrote the book, Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance. Dr. Shad Hamoure holds a doctorate from the University of Manchester, as well as degrees from Sciences Po and the University of Jordan. She is a lecturer in international law at the University of Kent, and is the author of the forthcoming book, Corporate War Profiteering and International Law. Dr. Hamoura has previously acted as consultant on the question of Palestine and international law, and she is currently a non-resident fellow at Al-Haq Center for Applied International Law. So first of all, I would like to discuss with you, and thank you colleagues for joining us for this webinar. I would first like to discuss popular characterizations of Hamas as a terrorist group. And then my first question is then to Dr. Baconi. In your book, Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, you carefully explain how Hamas is a multifaceted liberation organization, which is rooted in the nationalist claims of the Palestinian people. As a close observer, what do you think it is that politicians, media pundits, and even scholars routinely refer to? Why do you think it is that they simply refer to Hamas simply as a terrorist organization? Please.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for having me at this webinar and for hosting this esteemed panel. Well, I think the answer to the question is quite simple, actually. So the designation of Hamas solely as a terrorist organization obfuscates any of its social or political characteristics and allows states to then deal with Hamas solely through military means. And this is something, of course, that Israel pushes forward, that rather than engaging with Hamas as an organization that is quite complex, that is a central part of the Palestinian national movement, that has a very clear political agenda, by designating it a terrorist organization, it then becomes justified in dealing with Hamas solely through the lens of military. So it turns something that's political into something that's security. And there are two things that designation ends up obfuscating. The first is the social infrastructure of Hamas. So Hamas is a party that comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Before it was established in 1987, it had built, the Muslim Brotherhood had engaged in building a vast social infrastructure of charities and healthcare centers and nurseries and schools and educational centers. And that infrastructure still in many ways sustains Hamas and Hamas's involvement in the community today. But it also obfuscates the fact that since 1987 and since Hamas's emergence as a political and a military party, it has put forward political demands that compel Israel to engage with the core of the Palestinian struggle, which is the right to self-determination, the right of Palestinians to return to homes from which they were expelled in 1948, the end to Israel's settler colonial regime and apartheid regime, and so on and so forth. So rather than engaging with political demands that even Hamas leaders argue are more in line with international law than Israeli apartheid leaders, rather than engaging with those demands, rather than engaging with them in any kind of serious way, using the designation of terrorism, then justifies completely ignoring those demands. So just as a major example, in 2017, Hamas put forward a revised charter where it said it is willing to accept a Palestinian state on 67, which is in line with accepting the notion of partition of the land of historic Palestine, rather than engaging with those political demands, which are actually sort of closer to a resolution than any Israeli leader has ever offered the Palestinian people. The demands are completely ignored, and if not ignored, then used as fodder to justify Israeli military campaigns. And we see that most actively actually in October 7th. So rather than engaging with the wider context from which that attack emerged, we see the immediate rhetoric that's coming out as one that's equating Hamas to, let's say, ISIS or to Al-Qaeda, and in some ways preemptively preparing the international public, but also the Western public, the Israeli public, to accept any kind of retaliation, to accept any kind of force, because this is not a rational party that has political demands that we must engage with. This is a bloodthirsty party that's barbaric, that's committed to the annihilation of the Jewish people. So the label of terrorism allows that reframing to happen and removes any kind of political or social context from this, and in some ways removes the responsibility of politicians to engage with this issue politically.
Thank you so much. Indeed, understanding much better the social and political context is the very reason why we are situating this discussion, not just within questions of international law, but also in a broader social context. Thank you very much. Dr. Hamoura, going back to the law, from an international law standpoint, apart from what we've heard from Dr. Baconi, there seems to be a significant problem to legally characterize Hamas as a terrorist organization, for the one simple reason being that there's no agreed legal definition as to what is terrorism, or even what is a terrorist organization. States that regard a group as terrorist are pitted against other states who regard these groups as resistance fighters. So since international law lacks a definition of what is a terrorist group, the big question is, how should such groups, including Hamas, be correctly characterized according to international law? Please.
I thank you for that, Jeff. So to start with, as you say, there is this very big tension between two notions here, which are terrorism and resistance. And I'll start with the first one, just to elaborate on its connotation and understanding in international law. First of all, as you kindly noted, it does lack a definition. And indeed, this problem has been, and this has been a discussion at the United Nations since the 1960s. If we look towards practice to establish a definition, we will be met with a tapestry of contradictions, where the notion of terrorist was used in an exceptionalist light underlined by racist, colonial, and imperial interests to promote a fragmented reading of international law, which undermines legal instruments designed to protect human life. A short study of the so-called war on terror would easily reveal such contradictions. The notion of terrorism is, of course, particularly dangerous in context of settler colonization, such as the one in Palestine, and I'm happy to elaborate on that further on in the discussion. Of course, this danger is not a new danger, as the history of colonization reveals the repetitive use of this notion to justify colonial violence. Resistance against colonization inevitably will often be associated with non-state actors in an asymmetrical context, using non-conventional methods of warfare. Such elements are always associated with the label of terrorism. Examples of such historic use can be found with the reference or the usage of the label of terrorism towards the ANC in apartheid South Africa, the Algerian FLN, SWAPO in Namibia, RENAMO in Mozambique, Black liberation movements in the US, among others, all of which are movements that ended in the reclamation of the legitimate rights that we do not contest nowadays. In these contexts, the notion was used of terrorism, as noted by my colleague, it was used to undermine international humanitarian law and dehumanize the people. As Vasuki Nasaya noted, in these contexts, the distinction of the colonized colonizer trumps the civilian combatant distinction, and the notion terrorism is used as a tool to legitimize that. It's also very important to note here that the notion of terrorism was used to delegitimize these movements in the media and manufacture consent for brutal dehumanization. We see that now happen very clearly in the use of atrocity propaganda to justify a very retributive comprehension of self-defense by Israel, if you may call it an eye for a village, affirming the redundancy and dangerousness of this notion. So, of course, the Global South has contested this notion on and again. So members of the states of the Global South at the UN were astutely aware of this danger. Herein, they asserted the people's right to struggle by all means available at their end, and the people's right of resistance repeatedly in the 1960s and 70s, affirming the differentiation between resistance and terrorism. In the debate in relation to the notion on terrorism in 1972, in the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 4061, states asserted the right of resistance and differentiated it from terrorism in the preamble, and then asked for states to cooperate to end the root causes of terrorism, identifying colonization and alien occupation as being two of that. And if I may end on this short note, which is, why is it that the notion of terrorism is still tolerated in international legal circles? The answer that I find coming back to me again and again is that international lawyers perceive but do not conceptualize of colonization. And by that, I mean, no respectable international lawyer would say that colonialism is justified. But most international lawyers still lack a conceptualization of what colonization actually is. If experiences of states of the global south were taken seriously, and their state practice and scholarly argumentation that stressed that's differentiation, that stressed atrocity propaganda, that stressed that genocide is a symptom of colonization, and that resistance will always happen in relation to settler colonization. And these arguments were given weight in the doctrine of sources, then the above mentioned dangers would have been really obvious in the debate in this past 6 months. However, the problem is that despite very early warnings from states of the global south that this experiences of states of the global south need to be taken seriously. And here I'm referencing a very famous judgment by the opinion by Judge Alvarez in 1952 in the Anglo-Iranian oil case, where he noted that we undermine what happened in colonization. That call wasn't taken seriously, but that call wasn't taken seriously not in the name of justice, but rather in the name of politics and power that serves the interests of states that make the most out of the proliferation of war. And this notion, hence, must be taken quite with a lot of precaution, and must be dealt with very critically when understanding and assessing what we have here and looking at this historical tension between these two categories.
Thank you so much. Indeed, the historical contextual situating is absolutely crucial here. Labeling resistance group as terrorist, of course, has precedence, as you rightly pointed out. And having some background myself in South Africa, I'm very much aware of the African National Congress. Nelson Mandela himself were deemed terrorists and terrorist organizations. So now a question to Ms. Albanese. Setting aside these political and legal designations, which are, as we heard, very problematic, certainly highly contested and historically situated, how ought Hamas to be regarded by the United Nations and third states, if only in the interests of ending this brutal war against Palestinians in Gaza? You'll need to unmute, Francesca.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff. And it's such a privilege to be with Tareq and Shahad in the same discussion, because this is exactly the kind of voices we need to hear in order to bring the facts back to the table and the legal qualifications, because both of them have disappeared in this quite binary and extreme logic that has been used. And the title of this webinar is intentionally provocative: National Liberation Movement, no matter what, or terrorist organization, no matter what. I think that this dichotomy can be found as well within the United Nations, which, as you know, as you understand fully and you see fully, the fallout of it is not a monolith. And there are UN organizations, UN offices and Secretary General, and then there are member states. So member states, particularly in the West, tend to embrace an approach to terrorism, even in the absence of a definition. So everyone knows how to punish terrorism without even agreeing on what constitutes terrorism. And this is the thing, there has been a shift which has accelerated, as Shahad was saying. It's not new. I mean, this the settler colonialism and the struggle for self-determination have always been the fertile ground for colonial powers to turn against the native people through the security angle. And so the allegation of terrorism was of course there, but it has accelerated after the 9/11. So whether 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was an appreciation that of what national liberation movements were as part of the decolonization process. Today, there is no appreciation of what resistance is. And therefore, it's even easier to categorize whatever the Palestinians do as terrorism. This precedes the 7th of October, and this is beyond the Gaza Strip. It has happened. This qualification of Palestinians as terrorists has happened in the West Bank, where there is no Al-Qassam brigade. There is no military presence of Hamas. So the United Nations there is something important that was said by Martin Griffith, the UN Relief and Humanitarian Coordinator. A few months ago, he issued a statement that sent shockwaves, because he's a very senior UN official and very well respected among diplomats. And he said, quote, Hamas is not on the list of groups designated as terrorists by the United Nations. This does not make their acts of terror less horrific and reprehensible. End of quote. And this is, I think, I didn't have any hesitation in qualifying what happened on the 7th of October as prima facie war crimes. And then, of course, there should be an investigation, because it's also true that we do not have a full picture of who did what, including there was Hamas combatants, but there were also the Palestinian armed groups. There were other individuals. So we need to know exactly who did what, and this is what is prohibited. This is what is prevented by the approach. It's terrorism, and therefore this triggers Article 51 of the UN Charter, meaning self-defense, as Tareq was saying, the military response. This cancels all nuances and allows military violence. But this critically violates, it's not only an insult to the right of self-determination, and again, the right to resist has limits within international law. The Palestinians, as all people whose right of self-determination is not realized yet, have a right to resist. This doesn't mean that they can kill civilians. The resistance encounters the same limits as any other. No, actually, it encounters limits. So targeting civilians, killing civilians, taking civilian hostages is against international law. But as I've often said, an illegitimate and unlawful act of a people who resist collectively and in various forms, including through various groups, doesn't delegitimize the right to resist. While we need to refocus our attention on Israel, which is clearly an unlawful occupant, an unlawful occupier, an unlawful occupier. And this is where we need to bring our attention and also scrutiny, because it's in that unlawfulness that we find the trigger for the violence that continues to occur and spiral in the occupied Palestinian territory. There has been a weaponization, a critical weaponization of the terrorism definition and counter-terrorism measures in a way which has crushed not only the right of self-determination, but also other basic rights protected, civil and political rights, and violated international humanitarian law. So I would stop here and then happy to continue.
Well, it actually feeds very nicely, Francesca, into the next part of our discussion, which is discussion more broadly on movements of national liberation and, of course, the rights of protected persons. So getting back to Dr. Baconi, there are many Palestinian groups and factions that have emerged, particularly during Israel's many decades-long occupation of the Palestinian territories. The Palestine Liberation Organization is arguably the most well-known and consists, also international lawyers incidentally, and consists of several different organizations which are members of the PLO. What seems common to all groups that are part of the PLO is that they argue, and indeed other groups such as Hamas, is that they argue the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, a right indeed explicitly recognized by the International Court of Justice. We'll be getting back to that again in a later webinar. But apart from being clearly misleading, as you've already explained to us, why do narrow characterizations of Hamas prevent us from understanding its central role in realizing the Palestinian claim to self-determination in terms of international law? And what is actually its relationship? What is the relationship between Hamas and the PLO? Please.
Thank you, Jeff. One of the things that's really important for us to understand when we try to think about how the Israelis are positioning or explaining Hamas is this idea that if Hamas were to disappear tomorrow, there would be peace in Israel-Palestine, that Hamas is part of the problem, that if there isn't that kind of terrorist organization, then the Palestinians and the Israelis would be able to achieve some kind of resolution. And we see this happening actually mostly in how Israeli leaders talk about Gaza, that the Gaza Strip is under blockade because it's governed by Hamas. And that kind of framing is completely misleading because, for example, if we look at the Gaza Strip specifically, the Gaza Strip had faced 12 wars by Israel against the Palestinians in Gaza since 1948. The blockade had been initiated on the Gaza Strip before Hamas had even come to power or emerged into the party that it is today. But placing Hamas or viewing Hamas in that kind of narrow way suggests that that violence that Hamas employs, or that Hamas itself, is what is preventing Palestinian self-determination. It is then not seen to be part of the Palestinian political movement, but somehow outside of it. And this is very important for your question around what Hamas's relationship with the PLO. The PLO is the representative, the only representative of the Palestinian people on the international stage. Hamas has consistently sought to be a part of the PLO through democratic elections, first into the body of the PA with the intention of joining the PLO. And it has consistently been prevented from joining the body of the PLO because as far as the Israeli apartheid leadership is concerned, as far as the international community is concerned, the PLO as a representative, legitimate movement seeking self-determination is their greatest threat. They're focused on, obviously, the delegitimization of the PLO, but also the delegitimization of Hamas and ensuring fragmentation between all of these political parties that constitute the Palestinian national movement. It's important to sort of note that the PLO historically was also designated as a terrorist organization when it used military forms of revolutionary struggle in order to push for the liberation of Palestine. The only time that the PLO had been accepted into the diplomatic fold and negotiations allowed was when the PLO came out and renounced the use of armed force, but then recognized the state of Israel and the partition of Palestine, hopefully in the pursuit of a Palestinian state. The Palestinian state has never been allowed to be established. And the PLO has, over the course of the past 3 decades, become actually a significant part of the status quo. The Palestinian Authority, which is a central pillar of the Israeli apartheid regime, has more or less subsumed the PLO, has sort of turned the question of liberation into a question of governance, right? And so when Hamas comes in and says, you know, we need to resuscitate the PLO, we need to create a representative Palestinian leadership that is seeking liberation, any kind of discussion of Palestinian liberation and self-determination is deemed terroristic. And Francesca here is right. Even if we take out the military resistance out of the equation, even popular resistance, legal resistance, economic resistance is deemed as terrorism because the issue isn't the means employed. The issue is that Palestinians have no right, as far as the Israelis and the Western leadership are concerned, to resist settler colonialism. They have to acquiesce and they have to accept the status quo. And so Hamas is seen as a troublemaker. It's seen as something that is destabilizing the status quo that from the Israeli perspective is quite stable because it maintains Israeli domination.
Thank you very much. We've got another follow-up question a bit later, but before that, I would like to go to Dr. Hammoura. Again, we're also talking about protected persons who are part of this right of self-determination. And in an article for the Al Jazeera Journal, you discuss the genocidal dimension of the conflict in Palestine. We're going to, again, discuss this question around genocide in the second of our webinar series. But you referred to this as a serious threat to international peace and security. Moreover, you insisted that member states are required to stop violations of international law through pressure and economic measures. They have a duty towards civilians as protected persons, in particular, to prevent genocide against them. What then specifically are states to be doing as a bare minimum, according to international law, in order to protect Palestinians in Gaza? Certainly not what is taking place now, I would think. And what more could they do to alleviate current suffering of Palestinians?
Thank you for that, Jeff. So to start with, I would say very raw that states have the duty to start calling things by their name. The context of Palestine is a context of multiple, an accumulation of grave illegalities of preemptory norms of international law, as we recently saw in the advisory case in relation to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. There is clear violations of the Palestinian people's right of self-determination, the prohibition against apartheid, the prohibition against aggression, and now, of course, the prohibition against genocide. Looked at through one lens, what we see is a context of very clear alien domination and subjugation. This is how we referred to Palestine in the 1960s and 70s, and yet not again through claims to justice, but rather through power playing in the establishment of legal representations, that Palestinians were denied to call things by their name. Even lawyers were incapable of calling it settler colonization. The second thing, of course, in the context of our discussion here, is the recognition of the legitimacy of the right of resistance. The right of resistance was repeatedly noted in even in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which stresses in its preamble that it's essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. What we have at the moment is a context of grave illegalities where the international community is not partaking in any effort to protect the affected population. And that needs to be recognized, that the only way towards the protection of the Palestinian people is to protect their rights and to give them those rights, and also to enable the enactment of international humanitarian law. Of course, I need to affirm, as Francesca has affirmed, what we are talking about here is the rules of jus ad bellum, which is the rules of starting war rather than jus in bellum, which in this case, what I mean is international humanitarian law applies to all parties and no party is allowed to partake in any violations of it. To take this forward, when states are, once we recognize that, actually, Israel as an occupying state needs to recognize that the Palestinian people as occupied people do not have the duty to be loyal to Israel. And that is completely consistent with international humanitarian law. And once we look at the history of international humanitarian law, we see that it's quite logical that they wouldn't have the duty to be loyal. And actually the protection of people who are being prosecuted by Israel. And here I'm, of course, referencing to the 9,000 people who are in Israeli prisons, for example, under arbitrary forms of detention, as we recall in the most recent report by the CNN, to the horrendous forms of torture being committed against them. In the face of all of this, it starts with calling things by their name, taking things forward. Once we recognize alien domination, subjugation, and these grave violations are inherently crimes against international peace and security. That is the red alert of the UN Charter. That is when states need to partake in every effort possible in order to end that. And that comes in that what I just said can be extrapolated from multiple sources. To start with, in the face of grave illegality, states have the duty of cooperation and non-recognition. In the face of genocide, states have the duty of prevention, where leverage and capacity to influence are important elements, and the duty not to be complicit. In the face of colonization and apartheid, states have the duty to take all measures possible to end the situation at hand and to protect the affected population. Perhaps that could start by listening to the affected population. So the answer, of course, and I'm happy to elaborate on that further, would start by active, positive actions by states, and that is through an immediate global arms boycott, energy embargo. And here, of course, I'm also referring to a call by Palestinian communities for a jet fuel boycott in relation to the jet fuel being used in the area bombardment of Gaza. But all of that requires a change in the status quo and a change in the words that we are using. Which again, back to my original point, to call things by their name and to enact state responsibility in all of its different forms.
Thank you very much. And I'm pleased to see we're already starting to see questions coming in. Please do continue posing those questions because we'll be getting to them later on in this webinar. But calling things by their name, this really resonates very strongly. And thank you for elaborating that. So Dr. Baconi, Tareq, getting back to you and specifically referring to an essay that you wrote for the New York Times in April of this year. So just very recently, you critically analyzed the possibility of a two-state solution, right? Which has been the dominant political narrative. you argue that, in fact, that this solution was already arranged in 1947 without the consent of Palestinians. And you further argue that realizing a two-state solution would perpetuate the continued subjugation of Palestinians and Israel's impunity for atrocity crimes. Can you break this down a bit for us? Because, again, a lot of people who will be watching this seminar will be very much thinking within a two-state solution framework. Please.
Thank you, Jeff. I mean, I think where Shahid left off is a great place for me to start. If we're calling things by their name and we're listening to the colonized population about how they're understanding their struggle, then Palestinians have been telling us since before 1947 that they're facing Zionist settler colonization on their land. And since 48 have been saying that there's an ongoing Nakba, and that the central premise of this is the expulsion of Palestinians off their land to make room for Jewish settlement and to make room for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, the notion of partition, which only in the 1990s came to be packaged as the two-state solution, but it's really the notion of partition that's almost a century old now, since the Balfour Declaration in 1917, that's more than a century old, that is focused on partitioning the land of historic Palestine to make room for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That idea is a legitimation of Zionism. That idea is a legitimation of the notion that Jews have a right to settle in Palestine at the expense of the indigenous population. Now, that came to be enshrined in international law through the partition plan in 1947. And that partition plan was passed into the UN system, obviously without the consent of the Palestinians because they were colonized people, and actually without the consent of any of the neighboring states around Palestine, which were either still colonized or, like Jordan, had achieved independence but wasn't yet admitted into the UN member state body. And so that partition, the notion of partition, was enshrined in international law without the indigenous population which it most impacted. And that then became a body of international law. If we fast forward 4 decades and we think about the two-state solution as it came to be, it was never about providing Palestinians with actual self-determination or with actual sovereignty. There has never been a proposal on the table that allows Palestinian full statehood with full control of borders, with all of the benefits of achieving sovereignty. It was always a way of giving Palestinians autonomy, so less than sovereignty, without actually really challenging Israel's overarching apartheid. So really, the legitimacy of partition or two-state has to start from the notion that if we accept that Israel is an apartheid regime, if we accept that Zionist settler colonialism is the struggle, is what Palestinians are resisting, then all forms of demographic engineering, of putting Palestinians out of their homeland, of preventing the right of return, of enshrining Palestinians in small Bantustans or silos, is really a way of accommodating apartheid rather than challenging apartheid. So if we think about the occupied territories today, it doesn't have the makings of a state. It has the makings of Bantustans. It has the makings of urban centers where Palestinians are restricted, while the Israeli population is allowed to grow and expand around them. And those Bantustans are never actually given the right to get to full self-determination. They're always self-determination minus. So if we really want to think about what real self-determination means, or if we accept what the Palestinians are saying, that they're facing Zionist settler colonialism, then the real resolution is not actually accepting partition and legitimating apartheid. It's pushing for decolonization. It's pushing for the end of Jewish supremacy in the land of Palestine. Then we break out of the idea that it's partition or one state, two state, and we actually talk about rights and both collective and individual.
Thank you very much. And of course, it also addresses kind of a follow-up questions in relation to the implications for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And probably getting into that would go beyond the scope of this webinar. Also, in the interest of time, and because I want to get back to Ms. Albanese, I would like to get to this point around the right to resist, because I think it is quite a crucial point. It has already been alluded to in this webinar. And indeed, one rarely hears in these discussions that there even is a right to resist in international law. It's sort of a taboo topic, even for international lawyers. So even though we touched a bit on this already, can you speak, please, a bit more to this right and explain the potential you see at the moment for further steps to be taken by the United Nations, third states, and civil society, both to protect Palestinian civilians as well as to help them ensure more participation from these groups in Palestinians' ongoing struggle for self-determination? Francesca.
Yeah, just as a post holder, because I think that there are some elements that are very critical, also taking this webinar as an opportunity to have two experts addressing critical issues. Hamas, the attack of the 7th of October being anti-Semitic, being prompted by anti-Semitism. I think we should take advantage of Tareq's presence and his own study of Hamas to address that issue. So yeah, as I was saying, as we were saying before, the right to resist is enshrined in international law, and it's never been. It's one of those rights who has never been a smooth entry into the world, in the sense that we see the tension with the establishment. I mean, recognizing the right to resist is also questioning the status quo, the power in place, and the power in place when the world started to know the language of right to resist was the colonized world. I mean, this is the right to resist is what colonized people claimed to undo the chains of the colonization. And in a way, this right is like self-defense, but accorded, recognized to people, while self-defense proper is recognized to the to states. And there is a critical element, and I think I'm abusing of my role here, because Shahad has written extensively on the right the right to resist, and so she's better placed than me to discuss it. But I want to explain how I've dealt with it in my own work as a special rapporteur. Is that in international law there is a prohibition to use violence, to recur to the use of force, but it's recognized to people. So there is this prohibition in general for states, except when there is self-defense. So when a state comes under attack, or there is an imminent threat of attack, but a concrete risk, in that case, they can use self-defense, meaning wage a war against, notably, another state. There have been questions whether international law admits this right to wage a war and the right to use self-defense against non-state actors. So here the interpretations differ, and there are some who argue in favor of self-defense being used against non-state actors, because they say the UN Charter was written at a point in time where non-state actors either did not exist, they did not constitute, I mean, they did exist, but they did not constitute the threat that they might constitute today. Fair enough, but my point is, this is not what the International Court of Justice says. The supreme judicial body of the United Nations. There is consolidated jurisprudence that says, for example, that this cannot be used against people under occupation. And this concept returns, including in the case of Palestine, in the advisory opinion on the illegality of the wall. Now, the point is that, of course, the court recognized the security threat that might emanate, or the threat that might emanate from the occupied territory for Israel. But this is because why Israel maintains an occupation that causes, that triggers that resistance in the first place. So the question is, again, refocusing the attention on the occupying power, and the best way to ensure Israel's security, to meet Israel's security concern, is to get rid of the occupation. But I also agree with Tareq. I mean, the occupation has been the way Israel's apartheid has manifested in what remained of historical Palestine, meaning what didn't become Israel in 1947-49. So that territory, the Gaza Strip, West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has been under military occupation in order not to have millions of Palestinians getting equal rights as citizens of Israel. But the point is that this is where we are today. And for most Palestinians and for a number of Israelis, it is a question of decolonization. There is no way forward other than guaranteeing that everyone lives in freedom, dignity, and enjoying basic human rights. So yeah, I would stop here and really defer to Shahad for further elaboration on the right to resist.
Please, Shahad, would you like to elaborate a bit further there before we get to the questions from the participants?
Well, I think Francesca already did quite a wonderful job, but in the sense of its sources, a quick brush on that would start with the work of George Abissab, who was working quite strongly in the 1960s, 70s to get a recognition of the right of resistance. And that was facilitated in the UN Declaration on Friendly Relations, where we can extrapolate the right of resistance from the preamble of that. But then that specific instrument is given a high normative value in international law. Add to that, in the additional protocol, additional first protocol, there's a direct recognition of wars of national liberation against alien domination and subjugation, creating a special status for peoples under alien domination and subjugation to practice that. And there we see a special differentiation between people practicing violence in comparison to states practicing violence. So while the right exists actually in multiple other instruments also, including UN General Assembly resolutions that, again, as I mentioned before, mention Palestine quite directly. And it's important to note that actually this right was very recently reiterated by the UN Human Rights Council in a resolution in relation to the ongoing genocide, which recognized the legitimacy of the resistance of people by all means available, of course, consistent with the UN Charter. So this differentiation and this nuance, again, has been repeatedly undermined. And if I may note, actually, state reactions to the right to resist and the right to defend and state practice is very obvious in relation to the case of Ukraine, where all states jumped to protect the people's right to resist against illegal occupation. And the history of that goes as early as the Special Court of The Hague and 1940s, where also the repetitive recognition. For example, in the Hans Albin Rother case, the Special Court of The Hague noted that the occupying power only exercises a factual, not legitimate authority. So the population of the occupied territory are in general neither ethically nor juridically obliged to obey it as such. It follows this, that resistance to the enemy in the occupied territory can be a permissible weapon. And everything that I just said goes back to the very logical argument. Without recognizing that in such a case of extreme illegality, where the international community is not seized on the matter, and that's an important point to make, and where the people have a very legitimate right of self-determination, it is very illogical to say that these people don't have the right to partake in acts of resistance in all the different forms possible, of course, in alignment with international humanitarian law.
Thank you very much. We are rounding off this webinar. We've have just over 10 minutes left, and there have been a number of questions posed in the chat, actually quite a number of really important questions. So I'm just going to pose one of them. First of all, to Tareq, we need to know more on the structure of Hamas and how many wings they have. Do they have a link with other organizations? Have they intervened militarily in Egypt during the Arab Spring, or is this propaganda? What are we talking about when we talk about Hamas as an organization? It's a big question.
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. I mean, obviously Hamas as an organization has evolved over the more than 30 years of its existence, but quite broadly, the movement is multifaceted in two ways. I mean, apart from the fact that it has military, social, and political wings, organizationally, the movement is geographically dispersed. So obviously it has constituencies within the occupied territories, and within the occupied territories, it has constituencies in Gaza and the West Bank, but then obviously abroad in Turkey and Egypt and Qatar and elsewhere. But there are also different constituencies in terms of the political makings of Hamas. So there's the military wing, which is focused on the operations, but then there's also the political wing, which is the political bureau that sets the overall strategy of the movement, as well as constituencies like the prisoners, which are Hamas members within Israeli prisons. Now, the movement is actually a very democratic movement. It adopts a shura approach, a consultative approach to make decisions. And the highest decision-making body in the organization has representatives from these different constituencies. And it's one that's democratically elected and that changes every few years. By and large, as the movement existed before October 7th, when decisions are made by the political bureau of the movement, that all the different constituencies of the movement abide by that strategic decision. But there is a separation between the military wing and the political wing. The political wing is normally protected from the details of military attacks, and that has happened in a way to protect the political members from the underground operations of the military wings. So let's say in the case of October 7th, I imagine what would have happened is that the organization had taken a decision at some point in the past that they're moving away from passive sort of acquiescence to the blockade into more active sort of confrontation with the blockade and attempt to disrupt the blockade. That would have been an overall strategic decision, and then the military wing would have been tasked with planning the operation without the political wing knowing the details of that operation. But in terms of Hamas's engagement in other areas, as far as I know, Hamas has never taken operations outside of historic Palestine, and it's actually been very committed, unlike other parties in the region, only to the idea of national liberation for the Palestinian people, and has never engaged in internal politics of neighboring states or of states further afield.
Thank you very much. And now, Francesca, I'm glad you were able to rejoin us. We have been discussing already issues about sale of weapons. There have been legal cases have been brought in the Netherlands, Denmark, and of course, also the ICJ. The question was posed by somebody else is, should we not include the US, UK, Germany, the Netherlands in the case of complicity to genocide? Why not specifically mention the EU-Israeli Association Treaty, which is then sort of financing genocide according to this?
Look, I mean, there are a few things that should change and that should happen in the months. I would like to say not years, but in the weeks and months to come. And we know that it's not going to happen because we do not live in an ideal world. But justice should be one of those. And when I say justice, means accountability, really retributive justice. It's time that the architects of the system that we have been talking about, an illegal occupation and an apartheid regime which has really confined, subjugated, and forced the Palestinians to live humiliated and subjected to indignities for decades now. It's time that the ICC takes care of it, issuing arrest warrants, because there is plenty to investigate and to act upon, and also the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is competent for state responsibility in case of genocide. Now, when it comes to complicity, complicity is a crime. So commission of genocide is a crime, incitement to genocide is a crime, and so complicity. Now, while it's very easy to recognize that all member states have responsibility in what has happened in or has not happened in the occupied Palestinian territory, because, for example, to mention one, international humanitarian law that has always been the main reference normative framework in the occupied Palestinian territory because of the occupation and because of recurrent hostilities. A common Article 1 has a reference to the obligation of member states to enforce, to respect and make respect international humanitarian law, while clearly Israel has been allowed to violate it on a regular basis, and genocide is not different from that, in the sense that the Genocide Convention, even more than other pieces of legislation, contains an obligation to prevent genocide, to prevent and punish genocide. So while to determine whether there is complicity with genocide, the court might need to determine whether, states' complicity in genocide. The ICJ will have to decide first on the primary crime of genocide being committed by Israel. But at the same time, there is the responsibility to prevent, which kicks in. For me, the starting point is at least the 26th of January, when the court or when the ICJ issued provisional measures, recognize the plausibility there is that the rights protected under the Genocide Convention for the Palestinians are at risk. So there is a plausibility that genocide is being. This kicks in obligations, and this is where now the attention is to be.
Thank you very much. I think really in the last few minutes, I would like to pose this last question to Shad, which is also very much in line with this theme. And I also want to remind everybody here that we will have further seminars in which we're going to be digging deeper into these questions around genocide and the work of the apex courts in The Hague. So Shad, it seems that interpretation of international law, also in relation to complicity, is really a relevant issue. Also here at the University of Maastricht, where I am at the moment, at the University of Amsterdam, Utrecht University, my own university, Erasmus University, questions around complicity, of course, are clearly burning questions and are triggering people to really speak out very loudly. So the position, but the interpretation of international law is really very much according to the positionality of those who do it from the Global South or from the Palestinian perspective, as the participant poses. Israel is violating international law, but Western governments and institutions do not think so. If this is the case, international law is determined by power more than its own discursive autonomy. How can Palestinians and other colonized people resist the complicity of certain provisions and institutions of international law with colonization? Aren't we, as those committed to anti-colonial liberation, locking ourselves in these compromised and colonial institutions if we think only in terms of the interpretations of international law? Please, it's a big question, but one.
Indeed, a very big question. So the thing is one, not within only the institutions of international law, but rather recognizing and calling out what I call to be the insecurities of international law. International law, alongside academic institutions, gain their legitimacy by some claim to justice and wisdom. They get their legitimacy by the idea that at the end of the day, we are working towards these higher moral human values that we all share. Otherwise, if it is very clear to us that we aren't only in the service of power, then that renders us redundant. So the engage with international law in this case is a strategic one. And what I've been saying is actually Palestine is a space for the critique of international law, but international law will not be used to liberate Palestine, because what Palestine is allowing us to actually is to express very brutally the pre-existing critique of international law. But to take it forward, what I say is, from the position of states of the Global South in 1960s and 70s, what they tried to push for is an interpretation of international law that is steeped into justice. So what they called upon is that insecurity of international law, akin to what I was just trying to say, to call upon justice and logic in times where truth is being suspended in the name of power, where the truth is being suspended in obedience to a status quo that serves geopolitical interests as well as profit and accumulating profit at that. So meanwhile, to call upon these ideals is a form of facilitating and enabling us to talk about Palestine in the language of justice, not just the language of politics. And that perhaps could be a strategic tool towards moving forward, and inevitably, of course, even in the case of universities, to call them back to what they are meant to serve. And that is wisdom, freedom of speech, and the capacity to, again, back to calling things by their name. If universities are not spaces where we're able to recognize an ongoing genocide as well as an ongoing settler colonization, where parents are being forced to carry their children in body bags, and the levels of horror have reached. If universities are not places where we can call truth by its name, then that needs to be then we need to speak the language of the institution, but then be able to critique the language of the institution. So one step further after that, in order to enable us to do that. And perhaps this is the exercise that we are partaking at the moment in this discussion here. And I believe that this exercise needs to be taken forward, because we need to utilize not just international law, but rather all forms possible in order to shed light on this humongous status of a suspension of truth that we're currently living in.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you, all three panelists, Shad Hammoud, Tareq Baconi, Francesca Albanese. Also to our people attending this session. We had nearly 80 people following this. We have recorded this and we will put it online. And we apologize for not answering all of the wonderful questions been posed here. I would like to find a way in which we can actually answer these questions and put those answers, at least some reflections, up on our website. But I want to make a very special thank you to the broader team that have been supporting these webinars: Sarah Troyan, Marta Ringa, Sarah Njiroge, Jane Pocock, Izia Del Priore, and Rowan Barakat. We certainly couldn't have done this without you. Thank you so much for participating in this, and please do register for our follow-up webinars in the weeks to come. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you,
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.